Welcome everyone to this class as part of Drisha's ELL programming. We're thrilled to have everyone here this evening. We are learning with Sarah Zager on the topic of can we change our character? Perspectives from the Bavli to the Musar movement. Sarah's a doctoral candidate in religious studies and philosophy at Yale University, where her research focuses on the influence of Judaism and Christianity on moral philosophy. She has an MA in religion from the University of Chicago Divinity School, as well as a BA from Williams College, and has written for the Lehrhaus, Jew School, the Journal of Jewish Ethics, and Nashim, as well as taught a number of classes for Drisha. In this series, tonight we are in the final of our three-part series. So the overall idea of the series is to investigate whether and how we are able to change our character using sources ranging from the Talmud to the Mishneh Torah to the Musar movement. We have been exploring how character is formed and what tools we have when we decide that we need to change our dispositions and our character for the better. So after exploring some perspectives from the Gemara and from the Rambam in our first few classes, we are going to be using tonight's session to look at the thought of two early leaders in the Musar movement, Rav Israel Salanter and Rav Simhah Zissel, exploring the ways in which Talmud Torah and Limmud Musar can work together to help us improve our character. So thank you all again for being here. And Sarah, I think we're all yours.
Thank you, Michael, for a lovely introduction as always, and also for your continued smooth management of Zoom technology. It is by no means as easy as he makes it look. Anyway, so we spent some time last week with the Rambam, and by extension, we spent some time thinking about Aristotle's emphasis on character. But I think I would sort of be doing you a disservice if I didn't emphasize to you that that approach to thinking about moral philosophy is not the only game in town. So philosophers, sort of thinking outside of Jewish studies, although also within it, tend to distinguish between two different approaches to ethics. One is one which focuses on rules or laws, which philosophers love to call deontology. Don't need to remember that word, I promise there won't be a quiz. And one approach which focuses more on character, which we tend to call virtue ethics. One way to think about the distinction between these two things is that deontology, or morality based on laws or rules, tends to focus on a given action, right? It's an act-based morality. So what I'm trying to understand is like, is a given action okay or not okay? Can I do it? Should I do it? Must I do it? And virtue ethics is much more interested in me as the agent. And what kind of a person would I be if I acted in such and such a way? Or what kind of a person should I strive to be? So this is kind of how the territory tends to be divided up among philosophers. But this way of dividing it up assumes that these two things don't have a lot to do with each other, right? That they're distinguishable in some way. So the idea is, if I'm just gonna look at the action, I'm just gonna look to see whether it follows the rule or doesn't follow the rule, then I don't actually care about character. And if I care about character, I'm gonna be willing to bend the rules sometimes. I'm gonna be willing to ignore the rules in order to preserve my sense of like doing the right thing for the whole person. And I think we can see this kind of sense that these two things are different crops up in Jewish culture all the time when we talk about halakha, right? So sometimes we say, oh, well, that halakha is really about making me into an ethical person, then it must be that sometimes I could bend the rules of halakha. And on the flip side, we say halakha is actually about doing certain things at certain times. I don't really care that much about whether I'm a good person or not, or even whether I'm paying that much attention. What matters is kind of, did I do the required actions at the required time? So that can tend to be how we divide things up. And the goal of my shiur today is to convince you that that is not a good way to think about these questions, and that there is some kind of deep connection between how we act in a given situation, how we think about halakha, how we deal with our moral obligations, halachic or otherwise, and how we think of how we develop as people and how we develop our character. So that's kind of the goal I want to get you to. And And the way I'm going to do that is by looking at two thinkers from the Musar movement who both give a very interesting picture of how some kind of Limmud or study can actually help us develop our character. So some kind of interaction with like texts that talk about all these rules we have to follow can actually help us become the kinds of people that we want to be. So that's sort of the picture of where we're headed. We're going to be looking at sort of two different thinkers who are really important in the early Musar movement. I think for some people, these figures will be familiar, but probably not as familiar as the Rambam. So I want to just spend a couple of minutes giving us like a little brief intro to like, who are these guys and why would we be interested in what they have to say? So in the 18th century in Eastern Europe, there was a kind of emergence of lots of new different kinds of Jewish organizations and institutions and like ways of carving up the Jewish landscape. And because there was initially this thing called the Kahal, which was a sort of governmental structure which did all kinds of things to kind of regulate the Jewish community. So it wasn't only religious, they also did, you know, basic taxation, all kinds of sort of simple civil services, and they maintained an educational institution. As the 18th century ends, and we move into the 19th century, that the Kahal institution kind of fades away and Jews become part of the emerging states of Eastern Europe, emerging empires. So they join Russia and they join Prussia, etc. And as that happens, kind of three big shifts or changes or even new sort of institutional forces emerge. The first is the Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment, sort of the move that takes Jewish culture into dialogue with all the things going on in European thought. It comes a little later in Eastern Europe than it does in Western Europe. That's one. The second, which you might think is much older than this, but really doesn't emerge until now, is the yeshiva as we know it. So you might think, oh yes, there were yeshivot in Surah, in Pumbedita, like way back in the time of the Gemara. And that's true to some extent. But the yeshiva as we know it, that like looks and feels the way yeshivot today feel, with certain kinds of structures for learning, certain kinds of, you know, the assumption that you would be going there all day, every day for some extended period of time, that's something that emerges in this period. And then the third one that emerges is the Hasidic Court. And the Hasidic Court is also a way of kind of cultivating sort of spiritual attention and religious life that's sort of parallel to the yeshiva, but is different. And we're really interested in this middle one, but the ones on either side become important to us, because what happens is that in 19th century Lithuania, the yeshiva explodes. It starts out as these kind of tiny little institutions, and all of a sudden they become very big and very powerful. That's a long story that you can all read more about in Shaul Sanford's amazing book about it. But in the meantime, the thing that I want you to know is that those institutions developed a new way of studying, where the Gemara was the central text that you studied all day, every day. Before that, there was a lot more emphasis on poskim and on all kinds of, like a different way of learning. And this was really sort of from the Vilna Gaon, sometimes called the Gra, there was this intense focus on the Talmud, basically to the exclusion of all else. If they had to learn halacha later in life, they would learn halacha in order to like take a certain kind of rabbinic position, but it was like it was a sort of side task. The key task was to learn Gemara. And so the two figures we're going to talk about today are in some sense a product of that modern yeshiva culture as it emerged in the 19th century, but they're also people who are in some sense critical of it. They're internal kind of critics of that system. So the first person whose work we're going to look at is Rabbi Salanter, who's sort of seen as the founder of the Musar movement, though he himself did not think of himself as really founding much of anything, except for perhaps a small yeshiva of his own. But he begins to express kind of concerns that the curriculum is too narrow, that the single-minded focus on Gemara has led people to not pay all that much attention to their own spiritual development. why is he so like why are the two other forces I told you about in the beginning important? Because Rav Yisrael Salanter is not only concerned about like the spiritual well-being of this elite group who end up studying in yeshiva for long periods of time, but he also becomes really concerned with people who are kind of leaving the traditional community and going into the world of the Haskalah on the one hand, and on the other hand, people who are kind of going into the growing Hasidic movement and who are not, who he perceives are like kind of getting it right in the sense that there's a more like outwardly visible and intense spirituality, but he thinks that spirituality is somewhat misdirected and he wants to refocus it. So he wants to kind of give you the Litvish version of the Hasidic like focus on spirituality, but he wants to do it in a way that's focused mostly on character development. So he's one of the figures we're going to be talking about. We'll get to Simhah Zissel, who's his like kind of main student in a moment, but in the meantime, Rav Yisrael Salanter is our guy, and so he's the sort of main figure, and he starts this whole ball rolling. Okay, great. So with that, I think one other sort of historical note, and then we'll read text and like actually get into things. There's a tendency to see Musar as sort of non-halacha or anti-halacha even, to see it as presenting some alternative to the set of tools that a purely halachic way of thinking would allow you to have, or even a purely kind of Talmud-oriented approach would let you have, or for those of you who are like cued into this stuff, like a very brisker way of thinking about like getting concepts out of the Talmud, even though that sort of postdates and whatever, doesn't matter. And I want you to get that out of your head. Because I think it's like a little bit misguided. There's a way in which it's true, right? He's going to come in and say, don't spend all your time studying Talmud. You got to do other things. Studying Gemara is great. It's extremely important. And also there are other things in life. There is a way in which he's saying that to you. But there's also a way that what I want to show you today is the way that he's actually using halachic terminology and concepts to talk about this like extremely novel set of practices he calls Limmud Musar, or the study of developing one's character. That he's using and manipulating halachic terminology all the way. And so there's a way in which, yeah, he is providing you this like a new way of thinking only about your character and like don't spend all your time trying to like make this little like distinction in the Gemara. But there's also a way in which he's totally cued into that stuff and he's using that halachic language. And one of the, I think, most interesting things that you can learn by reading him is actually learning, kind of experiencing the capaciousness of what halachic language can actually offer you. And he provides like one amazing example of that. Does anyone have questions about that, like sort of al regel achat, like who is the Musar movement, why is the Musar movement, etc. Thoughts or questions thus far on the raise hand thing? Oh, David, you've got a hand raised. You've got a real hand raised and a fake hand raised. Oh my, goodness me.
Yeah, I've come to Musar in the last few years through Maimonides, and you know, yeah. I've studied it. I love it. I'm not sure how it relates to like Ibn Pakuda and Moshe Cordovero, and yeah. I see those names referred to in a lot of the books that I read, but I've never quite figured out like what was old and what was new in the 19th century.
Yeah, good. This is like the $64 million question. Oh. So you're right on the money. The short answer is there were these things that were called Sifrei Musar that predate Rav Yisrael Salanter, right? So now if you go into like a bookstore in Mea Shearim, right, and you see the label on the shelf that says Musar, what you see is like Salanter and friends. Occasionally you'll see the Ramchal, you'll see Lutzato, like shoved in there, Mesilat Yesharim. Okay, that's like who's on that shelf. But before Salanter, there were all of these people talking about what we call Sifrei Musar. And those are the kinds of texts you're referring to, Ibn Pakuda, Chovot HaLevavot, and that whole constellation of like medieval Musar literature. And Salanter himself, well actually, no, Salanter's students wrote a description of what a Beit Musar should look like. And in it, they say, why do we need a Beit Musar? One of the reasons we need a Beit Musar is because not everybody has like Musar books in their house. They're not talking about Rav Yisrael Salanter's writings. We know that because they hadn't compiled Rav Yisrael Salanter's writings yet into a book. They hadn't published them. They didn't exist yet. So when they're writing that, they're saying, I think, they have to be saying sort of these earlier Musar texts. So there is a way in which, like, this is part of a long tradition. At the same time, he doesn't always acknowledge, like, you don't see him, at least certainly not in Or Yisrael, like you don't see him being like, and the Ramchal says, like he does it occasionally, but it's not sort of like really deeply steeped in like Chovot HaLevavot quoted on every page. So there are ways in which he's inventing a genre, and there are ways in which like actually the genre has existed forever. But to the extent that the genre has existed forever, it's a genre that never really made it, at least in the kind of European schools, never really made it to the top. One other note about this is that Tomer Dvorah is a very important text for him, for Salanter. So Salanter's initial, like first text where he kind of lays out his like opening salvo is basically originally published as an introduction to his edition of Tomer Dvorah. So he's talking to these people, but he...
How old is that one? How old is Tomer Dvorah?
Tomer Dvorah is... I don't know the date, so I'm going to look it up for you.
But much older than Salanter?
Yeah, much older, like several, like significantly. Tomer Dvorah is a Kabbalistic work, so it's like, it's significantly earlier. Okay, here's the actual text. Anyway, it's significantly earlier. So like, he's already, right, it's Codabera, so it's 16th century. It's like early medieval, right? It's old, not early medieval, but it's early and medieval. So there's a way in which he's inventing something, and there's a way in which he's retrieving something which has been lost or forgotten or not paid enough attention to in his mind. Does that help?
Is this important? Yes. Is this important for the discussion that we'll be having, or just to think about like the different terms and stuff? Like when
I think that it's more important for our discussion to understand how he's manipulating halachic terminology that is like more mainstream.
Okay.
That's like what I'm going to focus on, but there's like cool stuff elsewhere too.
Sure. Thanks.
Okay. Good. Other questions? Things in the chat? Mysterious people on Facebook Live? No. Okay. Great. I'm going to share a screen very briefly, and we will, well, not very briefly, we'll see the text. So hold on one moment. Here we go. Okay. In a moment, I want somebody to give me a thumbs up if you can see this and it's like a legible size for a human person. Good? All right, great. So we're gonna start off, right? I promised you that I would like try to show you that Salanter is interested in traditional categories. The way to do that is, what better way to do that than to start with the Shulchan Aruch? So I want you to look, this is a text that some of you probably have seen before, but I want you to just like try to see it with fresh eyes and try to pick out what are the kind of salient important features of Talmud Torah. So, Kol Ish Yisrael Chayav v'Talmud Torah. So far, so good. Every Jewish man is obligated to study Torah. Okay. Bein ani, bein ashir, bein shalem begufo, bein bal yisurin, bein bachor, bein zaken gadol, afilu oni, hamechazer al ptachim, afilu bal isha, uvanim, chayav likboa lo zman letalmud Torah. Vayom uvalayla, shene'amar vehiganta bo yomam valayla. Okay, we'll stop there before we get to the Ramah. All right, so there's a lot going on here, but I want to just focus on a couple of small bits because these are the bits that Salanter is going to manipulate in just a moment. So the first is everyone is obligated, every Jewish man is obligated in Talmud Torah. It's not only something you should do that's nice to do, but it's an actual obligation. And that obligation is structured by setting particular times of day during which you study, right? Should be basically familiar concept of kviyat. Okay, good. The second thing is, first of all, women are exempt, right? at least according to this picture. I have many thoughts. We'll save them for a different day. And then the next piece of this that's important is if you are under some sort of external pressure, say from economic forces, if you are poor, even so poor that you are begging for your own food, right? To put it out all the way out there, that person nonetheless has to study Torah. Okay? So that's the picture that is described. Every Jewish man must do it. Women seem to be exempt, and you have to do it even if you literally don't have enough to eat. Okay, good. Now we're going to see the Ramah's gloss on this, and he's going to kind of take down a notch the intensity of the economic language. Uvashat adchak, in a time of pressure, might be economic, might be something else. Afilu lo kara rak kriyat shema, even if you only said kriyat shema, shel shacharit, ve'arvit, you're good to go. So the Ramah, all he's done here basically is quote a Gemara from Menachot, which says that basically you might be good to go if you just say kriyat shema. So that's like kind of the hyper ritualized picture of Talmud Torah. But on any picture, there's this sense that like, yeah, there's some pressure that's kind of exerted from the outside that might be enough to exempt you. But on the Shulchan Aruch's picture, no physical pressure can exempt you, and no economic pressure can exempt you. All right, that's the background. So far, so good. Now let's jump into Or Yisrael, which is Salanter's like main big work, written as a series of letters. He has a bizarre style of writing, which makes extensive use of the comma and very rare use of any other form of punctuation. And so it's like rambling in intensity, and you'll feel that as we read it. Okay, Limmud ha-musari, chova ha'adam. The study of Musar is an obligation for each person. Sounds familiar. Now that, I think it's like relevant to recognize the sort of like simplistic picture I set out for you at the beginning, which said like, okay, there's stuff about your character and they're following the rules and they haven't, never the twain shall meet. And actually already he's disrupted that. He's saying dealing with your character is a rule, is an obligation. It's something you have to do, just like Talmud Torah is something you have to do, just like davening 3 times a day is something you have to do. All right. Uveyoter la'adam hatarud ve'oska. And even though all the more so for a person who is busy with their work. I think probably he means someone who's like actually really struggling to get by at this time. Like the economic situation for Jews in Lithuania was like extremely bad. So this is very much on his mind, but he's trying to imagine someone who's like making shoes and not able to make ends meet. And for him, that obligation is even stronger if you are caught up in your work. I think this translates in interesting ways to our current culture, where like busyness is an important kind of way of talking about how you are, right? I'm very busy. I can't do that, I'm too busy. Like that language creeps into our culture in an interesting and a different way, worth thinking about. And a person like suffers from some like almost illness in their service of God. And a person who suffers from that illness will then not find it easy to use the tools of healing that Limmud HaMusar can bring against this very strong or difficult thing. So this thing that needs very strong cure. So this kind of fits with his general picture in which he thinks the soul is sick, and the thing you need to do it is Limmud Musar. And Limmud Musar is an obligation, just like Talmud Torah is an obligation. Okay, the question is, what on earth is Limmud Musar anyway? And how does it work? He's going to give you a little picture of this in the next passage. All right. DT, UDT. So this is how you know that he's writing to a friend. Like it's like a imagined letter, although he never names who he's writing to, and it doesn't seem like he's like actually writing to anybody. Okay. Hine anochi chashakti lemishpat. I've thought and I've judged about this. And he says a bunch of things. We're skipping them. Limmud hamusari halazeh. Ein lecha limud asher yakif chiyuvo al kol nefashot. Kol hanefashot. So this study is distinct because it applies to everyone, right? Remember, we saw in the Shulchan Aruch's picture, only certain people are obligated to study Torah. Women are excluded, but Limmud HaMusar is different. Hanashim Torah mitalmud Torah. Women don't have to study Torah, at least according to the kind of prevailing halachic view of his day. Koshi yom v'chaser da'adim sorot chas v'shalila. There, but and also people who are like basically whose minds are altered or made like are downtrodden to such an extent that they, because they have such horrible jobs, that they lose their minds. Like, again, an amazing set of language. God forbid that they should have such work. Yesh makom harbe lefatran. So there's a lot of room to say that those people don't have to do it, don't have to do Talmud Torah. Notice here, he's stuck something in. He's siding with the Ramah, but like with a twist. He's saying, there are people in my community whose economic situation is so bad that they don't have to do Talmud Torah because they've lost their minds because of their jobs. Again, I think this has like interesting implications for thinking about like what it means to be an overworked, busy person in today's world. Ish lefi anino v'sholel mechoyava v'lo ra'izeh k'ra'izeh. But our kind of study is not like that kind of study. Those two things don't match together. He's using a nice little phrase from the Gemara. Kol asher yachriv la'adam ken yagdil chiyuv v'chen yirbeh. So he's saying, our case is not like Talmud Torah. Talmud Torah says there are certain kinds of situations in which you're exempt. One of them is just called being a woman. One of them is called being so overworked that you lose your mind. But he's saying in our situation, a person can actually step themselves forward slowly, and as their obligation will grow as their capacity grows. And he then implies, actually, that women also are obligated in Limmud Musar. Crazy, like for someone in his time to say, but he believes that because everybody suffers from the same like illness of the soul, everybody needs the cure. And the only way for them to access it is through sort of slowly working through the system. Okay, so he's taken the halachic language of Talmud Torah and flipped it around for you and kind of expanded it and used it, even by contrast, to describe the practice of Limmud Musar. So even as he's doing that, though, he's borrowing the language of, he's like twisting the language of Talmud Torah and saying, oh yeah, Limmud Musar isn't quite like Talmud Torah. It's an obligation, but it falls on different people, it falls on everybody. At the same time, he is going to borrow lots of pieces of the way we talk about Talmud Torah in halachic language in order to talk about this new practice called Limmud Musar. So we see that in the next text. Hein elek sot darchei hamusar. These are a few of the kind of structures or boundaries of the ways of Musar, or Bahirhu, and it's a shining light. Ech lo nachish ma'asenu lehitkarev el limud halazeh. How can we have to kind of like speculate or suspect our judgments and or our actions? We have to figure out like how are we going to bring ourselves closer to this kind of study. La'asot lo yesodot ne'amanot bal yidmot. We have to give it strong foundations that won't crumble or break down. Leval yavor alav mikreira, so that nothing bad will happen to them. Chas v'chalila, God forbid. La'ashbit ha'ra'ayon ha'nizgat halazeh, lezot me'od nachon hadavar, this is the most important part, l'chazko b'masmurim nitu'im, likboa itim sidurim lazeh, b'kol vein mincha lamar. Okay, so he's saying, I want you to take this, you might think, okay, this Limmud Musar thing sounds pretty good, it'll let me like rearrange my whole set of internal desires, I would really like that. How am I going to go about doing it? And he's like, great. I know a set of tools for you. The set of tools is called Kviyat Yitim. We heard about it from Hilchot Talmud Torah, and it's you've got to set a time every day where you're going to actually engage in this practice of thinking about your character and trying to realign your desires in the right way. And he suggests, I know a great time to do that. It's between Mincha and Maariv, right? So as it was probably prayed then, it's a pretty short chunk of time, although maybe it's a little bit longer than we tend to have it in most shuls now, where it's like 10 minutes in and out. But he's saying every person has to do this, and every person should set aside a time that will make it possible for them to do that. So here again, he's borrowing the language of kviyat from the way we generally talk about Talmud Torah, not only as a kind of intellectual exercise, but as some sort of like ritualized practice that we engage in over and over again in regular intervals. So not just, you know, the 3-part series from Drisha, but actually like making this a part of your day every day. I saw a hand raise. Rebecca, hop in.
Yes, I have a question. So I'm doing a Jewish meditation class, and we were just learning a Mishneh. I forgot which Mishneh it was, but like it was like, what's the most important thing to know, or like thing to practice? And it was that bringing the sacrifice twice a day is like what you do. So is it like that commitment to practice, so like setting aside that routine time every day to do it, that's important? Or is it like the learning itself that's important?
Great. I think for him, it's got to be both. I think you'll get different answers, right? So Rashi, when he's commenting in the Gemara on the piece in the Gemara that's about like why you need to set aside times for Talmud Torah, he says, oh, well, why would you need to do that? Because you're going to get so caught up in what you're normally doing that you'll just like forget to do it. Okay, which is like an experience we all have. Oh, I was really busy sending that work email, and so I actually forgot to do this thing I had told myself I would set aside, you know, the hour from 3 to 4 to do, right? But I got caught up with something. So that's Rashi's picture, which is, I think, purely structural. He's just like, okay, you got to do this. The only way to do it is to like set aside a time, because if you don't, you're just going to get caught up in something. I think for the Musar thinkers, and really for Salanter, it's more than that, because he knows that the problem is not only like, oh, well, I'll be busy like, you know, sending off my work email or milking my cow or doing whatever like day-to-day task I have to do, right? I'll be like, oh no, I have to unload the dishwasher. But actually that this is something that I really want to do, but also my like Yetzer Hara is pulling me the other direction and doesn't want me to do it, right? Like thinking about all the stuff you did wrong is not like a fun way to spend your time between Mincha and Maariv. You would prefer to be kibitzing with your friend, right? So like I think he knows that there's also a kind of internal like hurdle that we have to get over in order to actually like do this work. So I think for him, the ability not only to get over the internal hurdle, but to train yourself every day. I've got to get over that hurdle, and it gets easier and easier. And I like that, I think for him is important. And that is the kind of like, okay, Klal Gadol b'Torah, the most important thing in the Torah is to bring your sacrifice every day. And that's it, right? I don't care about this other stuff. So I think for him, like, it's both. It's always both. And we'll see that played out in a little bit in the next passage. Anybody else? Thoughts, questions? Okay. Anybody in the chat? All right, good. So this is just the next little passage, and here's where he's going to give us another kind of answer to Rebecca's question, which is like, why on earth is this setting aside times important? All right, and the answer I think is basically the communal structure that will provide. V'ish et re'ehu yachazik. So each person will strengthen their fellow. V'yizarez la'asot tachbolot. So each person will basically help the other person like use some kind of trick or strategy in order to make this a good time for Musar study, right? So if you're like, there are all kinds of tools that you can use in a group setting to make this time productive, and each person will help another person make that time productive. So I think he would be very concerned about the kind of a mode of practice where like what you do is you go and you sit in a room alone and think about your character. Although they are more into sitting alone than some of their like colleagues in other pockets of the Jewish world. But nonetheless, I think it's got to be in a kind of communal structure for reasons that we saw a little bit of last week with some of the stuff with the Rambam. V'al yifakid ish ulai elesatan lazeh chas v'chalila. So also, if a person should be absent, God forbid, or if Satan should take him away from his study, I think we can read that, right? If we want to read that in a kind of more like contemporary sounding way, we would say, well, if he just doesn't show up, or if he's like caught up doing some like stupid, he's caught up in a useless argument with someone on Facebook. He's caught up in reading the last article about, whatever, like all of the things that Are Exempt might pull us to do that would distract us from the work we need to do. As המנכון לפקח על זה הדבר, לבקש עצה ותחבולה, לסבול שכלות ולפתות לבב בדברים רכים. So a person will then ask somebody else for advice. They can say like, I'm really having trouble with this. Like, how can I work on it? What can I do that actually is a good strategy for dealing with this problem? And maybe even to kind of, you can both like mollify foolishness, right? To like really come down hard, or you can, speak b'dvarim rakim in like nice, gentle language if that's what a person needs. Kol echad lefi darka. This is also language that's drawn from Talmud Torah, to some degree, because it's the language that's used to describe how you should educate a child, but this is for an adult. Uvazot yivaser hamusari. And in this way, he will entrench his moral foundations or his sense of Musar in strong ground. So I think part of the reason that you need to set aside specific time is if you set aside specific time from 8 to 9, and I set aside specific time from 9 to 10, that doesn't do us any good. We both have to be doing this because we have to be in conversation with each other. Because otherwise, I'm going to get caught up with whatever other thing I could get caught up with. Or I think, and more importantly, I could reach a point where I know I shouldn't do that anymore. I know I shouldn't be as, impatient or whatever, but I don't know how to fix it. And actually only someone else can tell me that. I need some perspective from outside of my own head. In that way, I think this should be familiar to some of us who were here last week and saw stuff about the Rambam, kind of saying the only way that a person will know how to make their character better is if somebody else tells them when they're going wrong. Salanter has a little bit more of a kind of open picture of what that looks like. And it can also be like, oh, I really want to encourage you, or I want to give you tools. This worked for me, maybe it works for you. That's, I think, the broad picture of where Salanter is going. But what makes that kind of interaction possible is this kind of halachic language he's borrowed from Kviyat Zitim, from the laws of Talmud Torah, and setting aside specific times. There's something about that structure which he wants to borrow from the halachic discourse and use it to kind of bolster and build a conversation around character. Okay, thus endeth the Salanter portion. Does anyone have questions thus far about this text? Okay, so now we're going to move on to you can see most of these. We're going to move on to Salanter's student, who is called sometimes their Alter von Kelm in Yiddish, or Rabbi Simhah Zissel Ziv. And he is a fascinating guy. He's sort of Salanter's inheritor in a lot of ways, but he's also very interestingly kind of in dialogue with Aristotle and with kind of philosophical discourse in a really fun way. And one thing that he adds really interestingly to the picture that we've just gotten from Salanter is that not only does Limmud Musar sort of look like Talmud Torah, in fact, Limmud Musar and Talmud Torah work together, and if you're doing them right, eventually they become the same thing. Right? So our learning and our character work are two sort of processes that help each other, and eventually when we do them right, they actually join up. So he gives you a nice little like pithy statement of this in one sentence, which is the source we're going to look at here. The ha'ikar lehishtadel lilmod musar b'seichal hadat, or the most important thing is to try to study Musar with with knowledge and intellect. He's much more kind of focused on that intellectual piece than Salanter is, and he has a like lovely sort of theory of its importance. So a good thing that's good at doing this is studying halacha bi'un, studying halacha in depth. Okay, you might have been like, wait a minute, I thought I was supposed to study character. Now you're gonna go tell me I have to study like what happens if I accidentally stir my meat soup with my milchik spoon. What? Like, what does that mean? There's something for him that's important about the study of halacha, and we'll see how that plays out in a minute. Musar. And then you need to do some in-depth study of Musar. And then the work you've done in character, on your character, will be useful for your study of halacha. Right? So just to like spell out this claim at kind of its maximally crazy version is, oh my goodness, actually studying whether my, what I do with my milchik spoon that I just put into my chicken soup is important for my character, and also my character is important for understanding what is going on with the spoon and this detailed halachic question. So someone who has brought these two things together is like the wisest person ever, and he is the verse, he becomes like the verse, lidat chochma musar, which is right knowledge of wisdom, and we'll just call it musar, we'll leave it untranslated. Notice he calls his book that too, he loves this pasuk. Perush yachad davka. We read this verse as meaning chochma umusar together. Chochma being halacha, and musar being Limmud. Musar is studying our character. So for Simhah Zissel, we start out with the study of halacha bi'iyun. That's good for your character. And then you need to look deep into musar, which will eventually change and inform how you read halacha, and you will end up joining them together in some kind of deep way. Okay, we're now going to read a kind of more extensive version of this, which I think is like one of the most beautiful pictures of what halachic thinking and decision making could look like. But in order to really understand this picture, we need like 2 lines of background from the Talmud. He's going to quote a famous little line about judges. And so the Gemara basically considers the possibility that a person wouldn't want to be a judge at all. Mali batzar, and then the judge would then say the following thing. Mali batzar hazah, what do I have to do with this pain and this suffering? Like, this is horrible, I don't want to deal with this. Talmud lomar imachem bedavar mishpat. And so the Torah says, God will be with you when you make judgments. And then the Talmud adds in this like nice little line, ve'ein lo lidayan ela ma she'einav ro'ot. A judge has only what his eyes can see, or what his eyes see. I think can is interpolated in a way that's actually not helpful. So I think, kind of on a plain reading, this text is actually just saying, okay, look, you might be overwhelmed by this situation. You might be like, I don't want to deal with this. You have to just like use your common sense and figure it out, judge. You can't like run for the hills every time something gets complicated. You've just got to try to figure it out. That's it. Use your common sense. See what you see. Don't overthink it. And this is basically the way that when this gets quoted in halachic context, that's often the way it's used. It's like, just use your common sense. Don't overthink it. Simhah Zissel is going to use it in a very different way. So we will see that in a moment. Okay. Here we go. Since it's known that the Torah is not decided in heaven. Okay, maybe that's known. That's duly noted, right? That's a very particular theology. We assume that there's no obvious like right answer to a given halachic question. It's just kind of open. V'raknim sara lehachmei hadur dayarei aretz b'kvi'at moadim b'kritut b'mitot beitin. So he's saying only like it was handed over to the wise people of a generation who live on the earth that they can set the holidays, right? They set the calendar. They deal with kritot, kicking people out of the community in various ways. and mitzvos beit din, or capital cases. Hakol ka'asher nireh lebeit din shel mata. Everything is according to the way things are seen by a court, an earthly court. It's not that these questions are decided in heaven, right? When somebody comes and they're potentially liable of a capital crime, that's not decided in heaven. This is just the earthly court has to follow its own eyes. Ve'al yedei nifsak hadin v'shamayim halacha l'ma'aseh. Could be actually ayadav. That's actually, there's an interesting different way to translate it than the way I've done, but okay. So it could, and in this way, let's say, the Torah is, or the law is decided in heaven according to what is done on earth, right? What this judge does. And so a judge has only what his eyes see, right? This is a pretty radical rereading of the line. It's not use your common sense. It's like a judge has only what his eyes can see, because there's nothing. Don't go looking for some divine answer to this question, because it ain't there. You've got to just decide yourself. And when you decide, then God's halacha will come to match it. Right? This is a sort of lo b'shamayim hi kind of picture of how halacha is going to go. Okay. Now the real fun begins. Ve'achar kach halot tzarich hadayan lahashlim atzmo b'midot tchila. And so, ve'im kain, not achar kach. And so in this way, isn't it important for a judge to sort of fill in his character before he judges, ve'az lo yeh mishuchad, and then he will not be partial, ve'az, and then ve'az ein lo ledayan ela ma she'enav ra'ot. So here he's saying, only once you've done the character work, then will you be a judge for whom you have eyes to see, such that what you see is actually meaningful. Ki yesh lo einayim lirot, because that kind of person, a kind of person who does have good character, will have eyes to see. Ma she'en kain im lo hishlim atzmo b'midah, which would not be the case if he didn't sort of fulfill himself or fill in his character in advance. As eno ra'ui liyot dayan. That person is not able to be a judge. So he's taken what would seem initially, right, to be a statement of like, just trust your gut, trust what you can see, actually turned it totally inside out to be a line about, I don't know if I can trust what I can see, because the only way I get eyes that actually show me anything is if I've already done the initial character work. So in order for me to be someone who can see the meaningful, kind of correct halachic outcome, I actually need to have done this initial character work. So we can see here that he's kind of speaking out of both sides of his mouth. He's like, you want to understand character? Great, go study halacha. And on the other hand, he's saying, you want to apply halacha? You better have done your character work first. All right. Ve'af im pa'am echat mechavein al ha'emet. This is, we're back to our kind of confused judge who doesn't have eyes to see. Even if sometimes that person, just by kind of happenstance, finds out the truth, gets the right thing. Ein Torato Torah klal. His Torah is not even Torah at all. Right? So it's not about what is the outcome up there in the sky, because that's not a real thing, right? All that makes something Torah, or one of the things that makes something Torah, that's a necessary component of it, something being Torah, is whether this person has done the appropriate character work. So even if this person can tell you actually exactly what you should do with your possibly treif spoon, that's not helpful, because their Torah isn't really Torah. What makes something really Torah is having first done the preparatory work and then deciding these questions. Ki ha-Torah einu psuka min hashamayim. There's no Torah up there in the world. Lo b'shamayim hi k'tiv, because it says the Torah is not in heaven. All right. V'zehu amram zal, and this is what the sages said. Im harav domei l'malach Hashem tzvaot. If a teacher is similar to an angel of God, yivakshu Torah mipiv or mipihu. then you should seek Torah from his mouth. V'imlav lo yivakshu, but if not, you shouldn't. He's quoting Chagiga. Now he's gonna give you his little spin on it. Perush, ki Torato eina Torah, because his Torah is not Torah. So the person who doesn't look like an angel of God, which I think for him means is of good character in a way that's obvious by looking at them, right? This is another place he's like playing with the sight metaphor. All right, ki Toreto eina Torah, v'zohi mitzilat tamzal, and this is their other interpretation. Kach onsho shel badai, af imomer emet ein shomin lo. And this is how we interpret their statement in Sanhedrin, that the punishment of a liar is that no one listens to him. This is like really strong language. He's saying someone who, even if they get the right answer, quote unquote, if they haven't done the initial character work, it's not going to get them anywhere. It's not going to do anything. Yeah, Rebecca.
Isn't it a little like chicken and egg, like what came first? Because didn't he just say like, you need to do the character work and you need to learn halacha so that you can like grow in the character work so that you can like,
yeah,
you learn it in halacha.
I think he's speaking out of both sides of his mouth on the one hand. On the other hand, right, so on the one hand, he's saying, you want to get your character better, go learn halacha. And here he's saying, if you want to apply halacha, you need to have a good character. But there's a little slippage there, which is this is the dayan, right? In order to be someone who's actually going to make judgments for other people, you have to have done this preparatory work. And the preparatory work may include things like sitting there and learning, big bodies of text. That may be, kind of part of what he recommends. In other places, he does, like when he talks about the kind of halacha that we should study, he's like, great, you want to learn about how to be a kind of better person in your interactions with others, you should sit down and learn the halachot of not collecting interest, because that will like teach you certain kinds of ways to behave and ways God wants the world to be. Yeah, he's talking out of both sides of his mouth, I think in part because he doesn't think that this distinction makes any sense, right? It doesn't make sense to say, oh, well, you got to do one. Like the idea that a person could kind of correctly divine the quote unquote right halachic answer is someone who's misconceived the whole enterprise. The enterprise is trying to carry out what God wants in the world in such a way that you are also a good person. And if you have failed to be a good person, you failed to do it. So these things are in a kind of soup, I think on purpose, although here he's kind of being rhetorically forceful, I think because there are people who he think are dayanim who are bad, right? And he wants to be like, you are not, their Torah is not Torah at all. I think that's part of it. Now, the really strong version of this is lots of people who make actually what would seem to be totally sensical halachic claims are not saying anything. And maybe then all you need to do is kind of get your character in the right place, and then you can say anything, right? Like that's the flip side of this coin, which might be like frightening because we're losing our tether to, okay, like let's sit down and see, like this posek says this and this posek says that. There's room to permit this and there's room not to, we can't permit that. Like the kind of the scientific nature of it, potential scientific nature of it, for him is just not there, or at least it's taken aside, a sort of side place.
Right. He's saying like you have to live it too.
Yeah. Oh yeah. You've got to live it, and not only do you have to live it in the sense of like, we better come home and find that you're following your own advice, right? If you're telling me I can't do X and Y, then you better not do X and Y. But also that like you have to have put in some affirmative effort in order to develop the character traits you have, right? That's more than just like, okay, I practice what I preach, but like on some sort of technical halachic scale, it's also that like I have actually trying to become a better person. All right, let's just finish this off, because it gets like kind of crazy. All right, Perush. Now he's going to interpret the thing about even someone who says the truth. If they're a liar, no one believes them. Perush ki ha'emet shelo eina emet. Because his truth, the person who has not done the requisite character work, his truth is not truth at all. Right? This is a kind of, not quite a relativist picture, but it matters for him, for something to be true. It matters not only that it kind of correspond with some external reality. Maybe that doesn't matter at all. What matters is the quality of the person who says it. Ki Torato eina Torah. Because his Torah is not Torah. V'haracha amar yirachem aleinu. And may God have mercy on us. She'yen lanu chelek b'Torato yitbarach. So that we can have some portion in God's Torah. Right? What it means to have a portion of God's Torah is not like to have some inheritance or even to have some learning or technical skill, but actually to be able to get at this kind of truth, which is only possible through some kind of character development. Hainu shenachnin atzmo b'midot, that we will prepare ourselves in our character, in the character traits that we need in order to acquire Torah. B'midot hanitzrechot l'kinyan haTorah, in order to really, to get the Torah, to acquire it. As Torato Torah, and then a person's Torah will indeed be real Torah. V'yesh lo chelek b'Torah, and then they will have a portion in the Torah. So the picture here is that there is a way in which the study of halacha and the study of Torah in general can be useful for developing our character, but it also has to be, that Torah can only be productively applied and lived out, right? If we imagine ourselves as potential dayanim for kind of our own lives, even if we consult, other people for advice, that in order to make good decisions, and in order to see the situation we're in clearly, we actually need to have done this preparatory character work. And that's why we need every day between Mincha and Mariv to spend an hour actually thinking about this stuff and talking to people about it. So that's the kind of the picture that I think taken together, they suggest that there is something really valuable about sitting down with your chavruta and opening up the book and talking about what's there. But only if you're doing that with an eye to becoming the kind of person who develops a certain kind of moral glasses for seeing the world. And also only if that conversation is not only about okay, does Rabbi Yehuda disagree with so-and-so or agree with so-and-so, but is actually has that intellectual fire, but that intellectual fire is directed somewhere and directed at helping each other become better people, which requires both the kind of rebuke that we saw in the Rambam last week, and also the soft words that Salanter talks about as also being important, the story. So I hope that you're able to find some version of that, even in this moment where we don't have the kinds of sense of community that Salanter takes as being really important. But I hope that that's nonetheless available to us in some way as we approach the Yamim Noraim. Thank you all for learning with me these 3 weeks. It has been such a joy. And I hope to actually learn in person with all of you at some point along the way. Thank you very much, and hope you have a meaningful Elul in these what's left of it. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for this really, really amazing series. Thank you everyone for being here. We really appreciate it. If you're interested in taking more courses with us through the remainder of Elul and Yasser Yemei Tshuva, you can find information on our website at drisha.org/classes. And hopefully in the next few weeks, we should have information up on our future classes for afterwards during the fall as well. You can also go to our website to find information on our Elul program that is running in Israel for anyone who's interested in Hebrew language shiurim or learning with some of our Israeli faculty. That is also there. But again, thank you so much to all of you for being here, and a huge, huge thank you to Sarah for a really fantastic class. Have a great night, everyone, and Shana Tova.
Shana Tova. Thank you.